The sound of the rusted tractor echoing across the valley wasn't what drew the neighbors to the fence line. It was what the 14-year-old girl driving it was doing. The Bell family's backfield was thick with a massive, beautiful stand of crimson clover, the first decent crop that exhausted ground had produced in a decade. It was prime for baling, worth thousands of dollars as livestock feed on a farm that badly needed the money. Instead, Nora Bell had the plow engaged, and she was violently churning every single acre of that valuable clover straight back into the dirt. Cal Mercer pulled his truck over and stood at the fence a long moment before he called out, "Girl, what in the world are you doing?" Nora didn't stop the tractor. "Putting it back," she said, like that explained anything at all. It didn't. Not to Cal, and not to half the county once word got around that the Bell girl had buried a crop worth thousands of dollars on ground her family could not afford to be careless with. Her grandfather Eli was 2 seasons behind on a bank note due that November, and everyone in earshot of that field understood exactly what a wasted harvest could cost a farm already this close to the edge. Nora had a different number in her head than the one everyone else was doing the math on. She'd found it 3 weeks earlier, in a cracked leather notebook that had belonged to a great-grandfather nobody living had ever met, tucked in the back of a shed nobody had cleaned out in years. One line, underlined twice, that she didn't fully understand yet and had decided to trust anyway. Never take the green away from the ground when the ground needs it more than you do. What that clover was actually doing, buried instead of baled, wouldn't prove itself for another 3 years, and by the time it did, it wouldn't just save one field. As you watch, see if you can figure out what a 14-year-old girl understood about that soil before anyone else in the county did, because the drought that was coming was going to make fools out of every farmer who laughed at her first. Nora had lived with her grandfather Eli since she was 6. Since the accident that took both her parents on a stretch of county highway, she still couldn't drive past without going quiet. Eli had raised her the only way he knew how, steady, unshowy, the same way he'd farmed 160 acres of eastern Kansas ground his whole adult life, hoping quiet consistency would be enough to get both a farm and a granddaughter through whatever came next. It hadn't been enough for the farm, not for a while now. Every year the soil got a little harder to work. Every year the fertilizer bill climbed while the yields it was supposed to protect crept the other direction. Eli wasn't failing spectacularly, the way a farm fails on the evening news with a bank auction and a crowd of strangers picking through the equipment. He was failing slowly, the way most farms actually do, one disappointing harvest and one larger loan at a time, until the math simply stopped working no matter how carefully you did it. She'd found the notebook by accident, 3 weeks before that first plowing, helping Eli clear junk out of the old equipment shed on a Saturday he'd been putting off for years. It was wedged behind a stack of rusted fence posts, small enough that she almost mistook it for scrap paper before she noticed the handwriting inside. Cramped, careful, dated entries going back further than she'd expected, the leather cover cracked and soft with age in a way that told her nobody had opened it in a long time. "Whose is this?" she'd asked, holding it up. Eli had gone quiet in a way that told her the answer before he said it. "That was your great-grandfather's. Thomas. Didn't know it was still out here. He hadn't reached for it, hadn't asked to see it again himself. Keep it if you want it. I expect he'd rather somebody read it than let it rot in a shed." The notebook had belonged to Thomas Bell, Eli's own father, who'd farmed this same ground from the 1940s into the 1970s. Most of it was ordinary: rainfall, planting dates, cattle weights, the unglamorous record-keeping of a working farm. But scattered through the pages were notes about Clover that didn't fit the pattern of the rest, half-formed observations Thomas had clearly meant more for himself than for anyone reading later. Nora didn't understand the line about never taking the green away from the ground. Not fully. But she'd read it enough times, over enough evenings in the shed with a flashlight after her homework was done, that it had stopped feeling like an old man's odd habit and started feeling like an instruction she hadn't yet earned the right to follow properly. She planted the clover on the backfield in April, mostly to see what would happen. By August, watching it stand thick and purple-headed and worth real money if she cut and baled it the way any sensible person would, she made the decision that got Cal Mercer out of his truck at the fence line. She plowed it under instead. Eli didn't stop her. That surprised the county more than the plowing itself did, once word got around. A grandfather 2 seasons behind on his note, letting a 14-year-old bury a harvest he badly needed the cash from. He had his own reasons, ones he didn't explain to Nora right away. Watching her work that field from the porch, something had stirred in him he hadn't let himself feel in decades. A specific, half-buried memory of his own father doing the exact same thing on this exact same ground, back when Eli was a boy too young to understand why. He hadn't thought about that memory in 40 years. He wasn't sure, watching Nora, whether he was more unsettled by how much he'd forgotten or by how naturally it seemed to be coming back to her. Cal wasn't as patient. He ran 1,200 acres 2 farms over, modern equipment, a chemical program that kept his yields respectable even in a mediocre year, and he genuinely believed, not cruelly, just with the confidence of a man who'd never had reason to doubt his own methods, that Eli Bell was letting a child play farmer with ground the family could not afford to gamble on. You letting a 14-year-old decide how to run your farm now? Cal asked him outright, at the feed store the following week, in front of enough people that the question landed harder than it might have privately. Nobody's deciding anything but me, Eli said. She's just the only one who's asked why the ground's been failing us. The ground's failing because commodity prices are garbage and everybody's margins are thin, Eli. That's not a mystery needs solving. That's just farming in this decade. Cal shook his head, not unkindly, the way a man shakes his head at a friend he genuinely believes is making a mistake. You've got a note due in November. You really telling me you're betting that on a kid's science project instead of doing what the rest of us are doing to survive? I'm betting 4 acres on it, Cal. Not the whole farm. And they're not my 4 acres to gamble with anyway. They're hers, long as she's willing to do the work. She's 14. She's the only one who's been asking why, Eli said again, quieter this time, and didn't offer anything further, though the answer stayed with a few people standing nearby longer than Cal's mockery did. Nora went deeper into the notebook that fall, past the sections about Clover into pages she'd skimmed too quickly the first time through. What she found reframed everything she thought she understood about her family's history with this land. Thomas Bell hadn't simply grown clover out of some old-fashioned habit. He'd run a full rotation: clover, corn, wheat, cattle grazing certain sections, manure returning nutrients to others, the whole system designed to build soil instead of steadily emptying it out. It wasn't romantic thinking. It was patient engineering, the kind that took years to show its full value, and asked a farmer to trust a process he couldn't fully see happening underground. And then, dated in the early 1980s, the entries about Clover simply stopped. Nora asked Eli about it directly, one evening at the kitchen table with the notebook open between them. Why'd it stop, Grandpa? Your daddy kept this up his whole life. Then it just ends. Eli was quiet long enough that Nora thought he might not answer at all. There was a drought, he finally said. 81, 82. Worst this county'd seen since the 30s. He told it slowly, the way a man tells something he hasn't said out loud in a long time. He'd been 23 that summer, barely a year into running the farm after his father's heart gave out, watching corn wither in fields his daddy had spent 30 years building into something rich and dark and full of worms. The banknote came due in August, same as it always had, except that August the ground had nothing left to give and Eli had nothing left to pay it with. A seed company representative had driven out to the farm that same week, a young man in a clean shirt, driving a car nicer than anything else on the county road, carrying a briefcase full of yield charts for a new hybrid corn variety nobody around here had planted yet. This corn doesn't care what your daddy's rotation was doing, the man had told him, spreading charts across the very same kitchen table Eli and Nora were sitting at now. Fertilizer program, proper irrigation, this seed. You could see 40% better yields your first season. You've got a note due, Mr. Bell. This is how you make it. My father spent 30 years building this soil a particular way, Eli had said. And in one dry summer, that soil's not feeding your family or paying your bank. I understand loyalty to the old methods. I also understand a foreclosure notice doesn't care much about loyalty. Eli had signed the order 2 days later, telling himself it wasn't a betrayal of his father's life's work, just a survival decision a desperate man was allowed to make. And it worked, Nora, he told her now, 40 years later, looking out the kitchen window instead of at her. For a good long while, it worked exactly like that fella promised. Yields went up. Bank got paid. I told myself I'd been right, and Daddy's way was just old-fashioned stubbornness. But not forever. No, Eli admitted. Not forever. Took about 40 years for the ground to start telling us different. By then I'd farmed my whole life one way. And coming back around to the other felt like admitting my daddy'd been right, and I'd wasted 4 decades proving otherwise. Nora understood, hearing that the story wasn't nearly as simple as old wisdom against modern foolishness. Her great-grandfather's system hadn't failed. It had simply asked for more patience than a desperate young farmer, facing a bank and a drought at the same time, had been able to afford to give it. She started keeping her own records that winter, methodical in a way that surprised even Eli. Most mornings before the bus came, she was out at the field edge with a notebook, a stopwatch, and a bucket of water, timing how long it took a measured amount to disappear into the clover section versus the conventional ground beside it. A small, unglamorous ritual that cost her nearly an hour of sleep most days and produced, for months, nothing more exciting than columns of numbers that looked like progress only if you already believed there was progress to find. Her hands cracked from the cold doing soil samples in January, digging 6 inches down with a hand trowel through half-frozen ground just to compare texture and color between the 2 sections. She lost an entire month of infiltration data in February when her notebook got left out in a rainstorm and half the pages ran to illegible smears. A mistake that cost her a solid week of frustrated remeasuring, redone from scratch, because she'd learned enough by then to know that a data set with gaps in it wouldn't convince anybody of anything. The first real test came that following fall, when Nora planted a small trial patch of corn into the clover-treated section for the first time. Not the full experiment yet, just a few rows, to see what a single season of buried green manure had actually done. The yield came in worse than the conventional field beside it. Not dramatically, but enough that Cal heard about it within the week and made sure to mention it at the feed store. Heard the Bell girls' science project corn came up short, he said, to nobody in particular, loud enough to be sure it got back to Eli. It did get back to Eli, and to Nora, and it cost her a rough week of genuinely doubting whether she'd misunderstood something in the notebook, whether Thomas Bell's system had simply been outdated in some way she hadn't accounted for. She went back through her data that week more carefully than she'd gone through anything yet, and found the answer in the soil samples themselves rather than in the yield numbers. The first season's buried clover hadn't fully broken down yet, hadn't had time to become the organic matter it would eventually become. She'd tested a system built to pay off over years by measuring it after a single season. She didn't have the full patience Thomas Bell's original notes called for, not yet. But she had enough to keep going, and enough to explain to Eli, calmly, why one disappointing fall didn't disprove 3 years of soil data pointing the other direction. The difference showed up slowly, and then all at once, the way real changes tend to. After a hard rain that November, water pooled and ran off the conventional field, carrying a visible skin of topsoil downhill with it. On the clover section, the same rain simply disappeared into the ground, absorbed rather than shed. Nora dug into both sections afterward, comparing handfuls of dirt the way a person compares 2 entirely different materials rather than 2 patches of the same field. The conventional soil was pale, compacted, close to lifeless. The clover soil was dark, loose, and, when she looked closely enough, full of earthworms, more than she'd ever noticed on this farm in her whole life. She wrote all of it down. Dates, measurements, photographs on her phone of the 2 soil samples side by side. Not because anyone had asked her to. Because some instinct told her that if this was ever going to matter to anyone beyond herself, it would need to be proven rather than simply believed. The drought arrived the following June, and within a month it was clear this wasn't going to be an ordinary dry stretch. County extension bulletins started using words like historic. Pastures across the county turned brown by July. Feed prices climbed. More than one farm started quietly talking about selling off portions of their herds just to make it through the summer. Cal's 1,200 acres, dependent on irrigation and synthetic fertilizer to keep pace with modern yields, began struggling in a way his equipment and chemical program couldn't fully compensate for. He ran his irrigation pivots nearly around the clock through the worst 2 weeks of July, diesel costs climbing fast enough that he did the math out loud to anyone who'd listen at the feed store. Every additional acre-inch of water he pumped on a ground that could no longer hold on to moisture on its own cost him more than the corn on that acre would ultimately be worth. He wasn't failing outright. But for the first time and longer than he wanted to admit, Cal Mercer was farming at a loss on paper most weeks, watching a system that had served him well for 20 years finally meet a summer it couldn't out-engineer. Eli's farm wasn't immune either. Most of the property was still conventionally farmed, still vulnerable to the same baked, compacted ground every other operation in the county was fighting. But the section Nora had spent 3 seasons rebuilding behaved differently, in a way that became impossible to ignore once the rest of the valley started turning the color of dust. She'd planted a deep-rooted heritage corn variety into that section that spring, on Eli's cautious blessing, the first real cash crop asked of ground that had spent 3 years giving nothing back but green manure. As the drought tightened its grip through July, while Cal's fields curled and browned despite everything modern agriculture could throw at them, Nora's small stand of corn stood green. People started noticing before Nora fully understood how visible it had become. Drivers along the county road slowed near the Bell property the way people slow near an accident, except what they were looking at was the opposite of a wreck. 4 acres of corn standing chest-high and vivid green, stark against a valley that had gone the color of an old sepia photograph in every direction around it. Not miraculously green. Not immune to stress entirely. The leaves curled some in the worst afternoon heat, same as anything else. But noticeably, unmistakably healthier than anything else for miles, drawing exactly the kind of attention that 3 years of quiet, mocked labor had never managed to draw before. Nora walked that field most evenings that July, just to look at it herself, running her hand along leaves that had no business staying this green in a summer this dry, and feeling something she didn't entirely have words for yet. Not triumph exactly, closer to the specific, quiet relief of watching a bet you'd made with your whole self finally start paying out. The bank note came due that same difficult summer, and Eli sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of him the way a man sits with something he's been dreading long enough that the dread has gone quiet rather than loud. A representative from a large agricultural company had come to the house twice that season already, a polished younger man named Ted Voss who reminded Eli, more than he wanted to admit, of the seed salesman who'd sat at this same table 40 years earlier. His second visit came the week before the note was due, and he laid out the offer plainly enough that there wasn't much room left for misunderstanding it. Guaranteed lease payment, Mr. Bell, regardless of yield, regardless of weather. You'd clear your note this year, and every year going forward. No more gambling on drought or soil, or anything else. Voss glanced, not unkindly, toward the window facing Nora's back field. I understand your granddaughter's been running some kind of experiment out there. I respect that. But an experiment isn't collateral a bank recognizes, and this offer doesn't wait around for 3 more growing seasons to see if it pans out. And if I sign, who's deciding what gets planted where? We would be, largely. That's the nature of the arrangement. Voss said it plainly, without apology, the way a man states terms he considers entirely reasonable. You'd keep the house, the equipment shed, a garden plot if you like. The working acreage would follow our program. Eli didn't answer him that day. He said he'd think on it, walked Voss out to his car, and stood in the yard a long while after the car had pulled out, looking at a field he'd farmed his whole life and a contract that would, in exchange for certainty, hand the actual decisions about that field to somebody else's spreadsheet for good. Eli genuinely considered it. Nora didn't beg him not to, the way a younger version of herself might have. She brought him her notebook instead. 3 years of soil moisture readings, infiltration times, yield comparisons between the 2 sections, laid out plainly enough that a tired man staring down a banknote could understand the case being made without needing to trust anything beyond the numbers themselves. I'm not telling you what to do, Grandpa, she said. I'm just telling you what the dirt's actually been doing while everybody's been arguing about it. Eli read through the notebook late into that night, and didn't sign anything the next morning. The storm came in early August, the kind of violent, fast-moving system a drought sometimes produces once it finally breaks. Inches of rain in a single afternoon, hard enough to overwhelm ground that had spent 2 months baking under relentless sun. Nora and Eli stood on the porch through the worst of it, watching lightning strobe across a sky that had given them nothing but merciless clear blue for 2 straight months, now dumping more rain in 3 hours than the whole previous 6 weeks combined. Somewhere across the valley, headlights moved along the county road. Cal, Nora guessed, out checking on fields he could do nothing to protect at this point except watch. By the time the worst of it passed near midnight, Eli was too anxious to wait for morning. He and Nora walked out with flashlights, boots sinking in mud already ankle-deep in places, to check the two sections against each other while the rain was still falling in a lighter, steadier rhythm. The conventional field, even in flashlight, told its story plainly. Water ran across the surface in visible sheets, carrying a fine skein of topsoil downhill toward the drainage ditch, the ground beneath it too compacted and lifeless to accept any more than it already had. Nora's Clover section, by contrast, simply drank the rain down without complaint, standing water nowhere to be found even close to the surface. Cal's exposed, conventionally farmed fields lost topsoil badly in the runoff, water carving visible channels through ground that had nothing left to hold it in place. Eli lost a section too, an older field on the far side of the property that hadn't been part of Nora's experiment. But the Clover rebuilt section held. More than held. When Nora walked out to check on it again the next morning, in full daylight this time, she found the water had simply vanished into ground that absorbed it the way a sponge absorbs a spill. Roots she'd never fully appreciated the depth of holding soil structure together through rainfall violent enough to strip bare ground everywhere else in the county. She dug down into that section afterward, deeper than she'd ever bothered digging before, and found root channels extending further than she'd expected, dark, crumbly soil structure continuing well past where the conventional ground simply gave way to the same pale, compacted clay it had always been. Eli found her out there that evening, dirt-streaked, staring at a hole she'd dug nearly 2 feet deep. "Grandpa," she said, "I don't think Great-Grandpa Thomas was just trying to grow better corn. No, I think he was trying to teach the ground how to hold water again. Like, actually teach it. Not just feed it once and hope." She looked up at him. That line in his notebook, about the ground needing the green more than we do. I think that's what he meant the whole time. Eli crouched down beside the hole, running his own hand along the exposed root structure the way he hadn't touched dirt with real attention in longer than he wanted to admit. "The land doesn't get tired because it's old," he said quietly, half to himself. "It gets tired because we keep asking it to give without giving anything back." "Is that from the notebook too?" "No," Eli said. "That one's just true." Cal came to the fence line himself in September, after a second, smaller crop failure had cost him more than he was willing to say out loud at the feed store. He stood looking at Nora's corn, still standing, still green enough to harvest properly, in a season that had wrecked a meaningful portion of his own operation. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just looked, the way a man looks at something that's quietly proven him wrong without ever having tried to. "I lost about a third of my north fields to that runoff in August," he finally said. "Spent $40,000 this year on irrigation and fertilizer trying to keep pace with a drought your granddaughters 4 acres just didn't need help with. They needed 3 years of patience instead," Nora said. "Which isn't free either. Just costs different." "How much of that clover did you plant?" he asked, without any of the mockery from 3 years earlier in his voice. "About 4 acres, the first year. More sense." Nora didn't gloat, and didn't feel any particular need to. "You just plow it under, once it's grown. Feels wrong the first time. Feels worse the second time. Third time you start trusting it." Cal looked at the field a long while, jaw working the way a man's jaw works when he's deciding whether pride is worth what it's costing him. "I called you a fool 3 years ago, standing right about here." "You did. Wasn't fair of me. You were 14. He looked back at the field instead of at her. "Show me how." She did, that same afternoon, walking him through 3 years of notes the same patient way she'd once walked her own grandfather through them. Cal didn't convert his whole operation overnight. 1,200 acres doesn't turn on a single conversation at a fence line, but he started with a section that fall, the same cautious first step Eli had once allowed his own granddaughter to take on ground nobody was counting on for much anyway. The following spring, 2 more farms in the county had quietly started their own small clover trials. Word moving the way it always did in a place that size. Not through any announcement. Just one neighbor mentioning to another that the Bell girls' corn had stood green through a drought that flattened everything else for miles. One of them, a soft-spoken widower named Hollis Ferris who ran 200 acres a few miles east, drove out unannounced one Saturday that spring, parking his truck at a respectful distance from the house the way people do when they're not entirely sure they have the right to ask what they're about to ask. "Heard about your corn," he said, when Nora came out to meet him. "Heard about the clover, too, though most folks telling it don't seem to fully understand what they're describing." "Most people haven't watched it work for 3 years," Nora said. "Just heard about the one good summer." "Fair enough." Hollis turned his hat over once in his hands, an unconscious gesture that reminded Nora, not for the first time that season, of her grandfather's own quiet way of asking for things he wasn't used to needing. "I've got a stretch of ground gone hard as this county's had in my whole life farming it. I'm not asking you to fix it for me. Just wondered if you'd walk me through what you did, so I could try it myself." She spent that afternoon doing exactly that, the same patient explanation she'd give Cal a season later, sketching out timing and seed rates on the back of an old feed receipt, because neither of them had proper paper handy. Hollis planted his first trial acre that April, on ground he'd nearly given up expecting anything good from, and by the following spring, he wasn't the only neighbor stopping by to ask the same careful, hat-in-hand question. Eli went into the bank that winter for the first time in years without dreading the conversation. The loan officer, a careful woman named Diane Osei who'd renewed his note reluctantly more than once, looked over the notebook Nora had put together, 3 years of soil moisture data, yield comparisons, the corn's performance against the drought laid out in Nora's own careful handwriting, and set it down with an expression Eli hadn't seen from a banker in a long time. "This is more documentation than I get from operations 10 times your size," she said. "You did all this yourself?" "My granddaughter did," Eli said. "I mostly got out of her way." Diane didn't need long to work out new terms considerably friendlier than the ones Eli had been staring down the previous summer. A note that reflected a farm with a documented plan for its own soil, rather than one farmer's hopeful promise that next year would somehow be different from the last several. Nora was 17 the spring she walked out to that same backfield alone, tractor idling behind her, and pulled a handful of soil up from ground that had once been pale and compacted and was now dark enough to smell like the deep woods rather than dust. Worms moved through her fingers, more of them than she could easily count, in dirt that 4 years earlier had barely supported anything living at all. A neighbor kid named Josie Pruitt, 11 years old and the daughter of one of the farmers who'd started a small trial the year before, had ridden her bike over that afternoon to watch, the way kids in the county sometimes did now, curious about the girl who'd once gotten laughed at for doing the exact same thing they were watching her do. "Doesn't it feel weird?" Josie asked, watching Nora climb up onto the tractor seat. "Growing something that good just to plow it under?" "Every single time," Nora said. "Doesn't get less weird. Just gets easier to trust." She thought about her great-grandfather's notebook, still kept in the same shed, its pages softer now from 4 more years of evenings spent rereading them. She understood, standing in that field with dirt in her hands, that what Thomas Bell had actually been trying to preserve across all those decades of quiet, patient entries wasn't really a farming technique at all. It was a way of thinking about land, the understanding that some of the most valuable things a person could do for ground, or for anyone, look from the outside exactly like waste, right up until the moment everyone finally understood why. She climbed back onto the tractor, lowered the plow into a fresh stand of clover thick enough to bale for real money if she'd wanted to, and started turning it back into the earth instead. If a story like this, where the thing that looked like waste turns out to be exactly what the land needed all along, is the kind of thing that stays with you, subscribe. And if you've ever done something everyone around you thought was foolish and turned out to be right, tell me about it in the comments. I want to hear it.